Hello and welcome. You're watching India Global. I'm Vedanta Agarwal. We have a lot lined up for you. Well, world leaders are in Dubai for the biggest climate change huddle. But India, as the strongest emerging voice of the global south, is at the center of it all. Can India and the developing nations of the world lead the movement towards achieving climate equity? Well, the ball now is in the court of richer Western nations to be accountable. So a big lead this week on India Global, the big COP28 summit, its outcomes and what does it actually mean for India. Meanwhile, on the diplomacy front, well, India's tightrope walk against global terror continues. After Niger and the diplomatic tussle with Canada, now the US Justice Department has accused an Indian government employee of a murder conspiracy against one of the most active Khalistani leaders, Gurpatwant Singh Pannu. Well, New Delhi's response has been rather guarded. What is going to be India's diplomatic strategy, however, in balancing its zero-tolerance stand on extremism and its delicate relations with global powers? We'll get you all of that and more, but first up, the headlines. PM Modi sets the agenda at COP28. He leads the climate finance session. He hails COP28 as it approves the loss and damage fund. It's a move towards fixing the West's accountability on climate change. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister proposes the 2028 COP summit in India. He sends a firm message to the developed world at the COP28 summit. He says, rise above your own interest and ensure equitable, just and swift tech transfer to nations who need them. India has now reacted to US's indictment of an Indian government official in a alleged plot to kill Khalistani extremist Pannu. India says it's a matter of concern and New Delhi has launched a probe. US meanwhile says India is a strategic partner, but this is serious. Meanwhile, on the Niger killing, Canada yet to give proof of India's hand. And as the truce expires, Israel offensive in Gaza now resumes. Well, in the 7-day ceasefire, Hamas had released over 100 hostages, mostly women and children. All eyes now on Qatar, US and Egypt to negotiate peace. The big concern now, China's pneumonia outbreak. Indian states are on alert. Well, China's mystery child pneumonia, is it the next epidemic? That's the big question. Our big focus on India Global this week. Well, the climate clock is ticking and world leaders are in a huddle. The Prime Minister is among the many heads of state in Dubai for COP28, the biggest climate conference in the world. This time, the spotlight was very much on developing nations, with India as the most vehement voice for a global transition towards climate equity. Now, even before the summit actually began, a big milestone in favor of the global south, the operationalization and the possible operationalization of the loss and damage fund is now imminent, something that India has batted for over the past few years. Now, this essentially means that poorer nations like India, who have always been expected to pay the price for climate change, will now be compensated for the wrongs done by the West. What really were the key focus areas? What are the challenges ahead? How is India's presence really significant this time? Well, NDTV is in Dubai and Mohammed Ghazali is now joining us live on India Global. So Ghazali, what have been the key takeaways? Of course, the global south perspective is something that's really come out as a major takeaway. The Prime Minister's presence there significant. What are the key takeaways according to you? What are the challenges ahead? Over to you.
Thanks, Vedanta. As you rightly mentioned, the day one of yesterday, when you say that the loss and damage fund was operationalized by the developing and developed countries and all the attendees here, today the tone was set by Prime Minister's presence when he reiterated the demand that not only developed countries but also the developing countries will have to bear all the responsibility and nobody can wash off its hands when it comes to mitigating the climate crisis. Besides that, he also took a pot shot at the Western countries when he said that we can't undo the mistakes done in the last century, but we need to keep moving forward. The Prime Minister also talked about that how India's contribution to the carbon emission annually at the global level is just 4%. So in a sense, he was suggesting as a voice of global south that all the developing countries and even developed countries need to join hands, and together we can it's time to take action, but it has to be a hand-holding approach between the developed and the developing countries. He also spoke about that how finance and technology are the two most important arms when it comes to fight against the climate crisis.
COP28 में न्यू कलेक्टिव क्वांटिफाइड गोल ऑन क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस पर वास्तविक प्रगति होगी। दूसरा, ग्रीन क्लाइमेट फंड और एडप्शन फंड में कमी नहीं होने दी जाएगी। इस फंड की त्वरित भरपाई की जाएगी। तीसरा, मल्टीलेटरल डेवलपमेंट बैंक्स विकास के साथ साथ क्लाइमेट एक्शन के लिए भी एफोर्डेबल फाइनेंस उपलब्ध कराएंगे। वी हैव टू बी एम्बिशियस। हमें संकल्प लेना होगा कि एनर्जी ट्रांजिशन जस्ट हो, इंक्लूसिव हो, इक्विटेबल हो। वी हैव टू बी इनोवेटिव। हमें ये संकल्प लेना होगा कि इनोवेटिव टेक्नोलॉजी का लगातार विकास करें, अपने स्वार्थ से ऊपर उठकर दूसरे देशों को टेक्नोलॉजी ट्रांसफर करें।
So the Prime Minister also spoke about the Green Card initiative. Now that is something which is the Green Credit initiative, which is there to focused on creating carbon sinks through people's participation. And that is one initiative that the PM spoke today in front of global leaders when he was sharing a stage with the representative of EU as well as the host of this COP28, the leadership from UAE. So that is something in simpler terms, if you want to know that what is Green Credit Initiative, it's a kind of initiative where any individual or every citizen of this planet can contribute in mitigating or fighting or taking little steps towards saving the climate, and he will be rewarded with some points. Now, the entire framework has not yet been designed that how somebody contributing towards this initiative can redeem those points, but it will be on those similar lines.
आज मैं इस फोरम से एक और प्रो प्लैनेट, प्रोएक्टिव और पॉजिटिव इनिशिएटिव का आह्वान कर रहा हूं। यह है ग्रीन क्रेडिट इनिशिएटिव। यह कार्बन क्रेडिट की कॉमर्शियल मानसिकता से आगे बढ़कर जन भागीदारी से कार्बन सिंक बनाने का अभियान है। मैं उम्मीद करता हूं कि आप सब इससे जरूर जुड़ेंगे।
And before I hand you back over to Vedant, the summit has seen a lot of experts talking about in the last 2 days that how these summits will only make sense if whatever initiatives and discussions are done here will be implemented on ground. And most of the experts spoke about that this entire summit will make sense if every individual in every region contributes towards fighting against the climate crisis.
Absolutely, Ghazali, you made a very important point that ultimately actionable outcomes is what we need, given the fact that the climate clock is ticking. Thanks very much for joining us with that update from Dubai. But there's a lot to unpack. Well, it's a rather technical subject. How does it actually impact you and me? Well, joining me on India Global, Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, who is a Fellow of Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Thanks very much, Mr. Chaturvedi, for joining us on India Global. My first question to you, energy transition seems to be a key focus area as far as India is concerned. But the Prime Minister made an interesting point. He said energy transition has to be just, equitable and fair to the global south. What does it ultimately mean for India? And, I'll go one step further and ask, what does it actually mean for you and me?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on the show. Well, I think the first very important point is that energy transition cannot be at the cost of development. Development is paramount, and that's extremely, important. India is showcasing itself as a leader of the global south, right? And there are many, many challenges for the global south. It could be education, health, sanitation, water. There are a bunch of challenges. The fiscal space is limited, right? So it's not that, India is not ramping up actions. It is already doing a lot more. Global south is doing a lot more in terms of climate change mitigation. But of course, in a limited fiscal space, you could only do so much. And that's why if developing South is kind of forced to enhance its ambition and mitigation actions, it means there is going to be some hit on development and growth,
Right.
and that is not acceptable. So that is why I think the very important point that the Prime Minister made was that climate justice is critical. It has to be equitable, and global carbon budget. He very interestingly also mentioned that developing South and developing countries need to have their rightful share and fair share in the global carbon budget. Right.
Taking
and for
you
all
from
of
that,
this,
Mr. Chaturvedi,
what is very important is finance. Yes.
And I was just coming to that point. One major breakthrough has been the fact that the Loss and Damage Fund has been approved. Its operationalization is now imminent. How is that significant? What does it really mean? I mean, dumb it down for us, because it is something that really impacts us all. What does the operationalization, the possible operationalization of this fund means?
Sure, great. So very important questions. First of all, the finance debate is about three large buckets. One is mitigation, then adaptation, and loss and damage, right? So what does loss and damage mean? So the floods that we are seeing, right? For example, the Kerala floods. And there is increasing evidence that many of these climate disasters have a climate angle, right? And this has been a making of the developed world because of their historical emissions. So it is kind of their responsibility in some way that the world and especially developing nations are facing the brunt of climate change, right? So the Loss and Damage Fund essentially seeks to aid the developing world and especially the most vulnerable developing economies in terms of recovering from such disasters which are climate disasters. So we are not really talking about an earthquake, because earthquake is at least till now not been kind of associated with the climate change. We are talking about climate impact events like cyclones, floods, droughts, heat waves, those kinds of things which could impact economies and people at a wide scale. So that's why the important part here is that it has to be, there has to be some support for recovery. So the notion of recovery from this finance is very important. And that's why Loss and Damage Fund, that's what exactly it seeks to do. That's the first part. The second part is operationalization. What does it mean? Well, the demand of fund for this fund has been very long-standing demand over like almost 2 decades now.
Right.
Operationalization means, well, there is a host, which now it has been agreed that the World Bank will be the interim host for this fund. The second is that the developing world should have kind of rapid access. We should not be stuck with the World Bank bureaucracy, right?
Okay, that's an important point there, Mr. Chaturvedi. And you spoke also about recovery. And for recovery, what's also important is fixing accountability. Do you think we are a step closer to fixing accountability as far as climate change is concerned? Because there have been many conventions, but ultimately you still see the global south, the developing nations paying the price for the wrongs done by the West.
Yes. So I think the historical responsibility principle is already enshrined in the UN. So in that sense, that accountability is already established. But what has not been established is that they have been consistently kind of taking targets and not delivered. That accountability has not been established. And one of CEW's recent analysis also shows that under Kyoto Protocol, whatever targets that developed world countries had, it was like if you ignore COVID, it was a very different year. But pre-COVID, let's say the target was around 18% emission reduction as compared to 1990 baseline. Between 1919 and 2020, the 18% was the target of emission reduction. Most of the industrialized countries actually just achieved around 3.5–4%. Right. So basically, you kind of you say in principle that we are okay with the historical responsibility argument. We are also willing to take these targets, but they actually don't do anything.
Right.
Similar on the climate finance front.
So equitable and just energy transition, and of course, a step closer to climate equity is what perhaps seems to be the biggest takeaway as far as this climate summit is concerned. Thanks very much, Mr. Chaturvedi, for joining us with that very important perspective there. But there have also been several controversies on the sidelines of the COP28. Even before it began, and perhaps soon after UAE took over presidency of COP28, questions have been raised about the balance between energy needs and climate commitments. Well, UAE is among the world's 10 largest oil producers, and even before the climate conference began, UAE Sultan Al Jaber is and has been in the eye of the storm. Well, he has forcefully denied a report alleging his nation planning to use this summit to strike oil and gas deals. Is there any truth to that? Well, here is the report.
As the COP28 host, the United Arab Emirates plan to discuss possible natural gas and other commercial deals ahead of UN climate talks an investigation by the BBC and the Centre for Climate Reporting has revealed. Now, this report cited leaked documents which it said were prepared for the COP28 President-designate Sultan Al Jaber for meetings with at least 27 governments.
These allegations are false, not true, incorrect, and not accurate. And it's an attempt to undermine the work of the COP28 presidency. I respect the fact that we have been clear, open, and clean, and honest and transparent on how we're going to conduct this COP process.
Sultan Al Jaber is head of state oil giant Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and the UAE is a major crude producer and a leading member of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Al Jaber has not committed ADNOC to cutting its oil production. He has extended an invitation to oil and gas companies and prioritized private sector climate solutions. The nomination of Mr. Jaber to lead the climate talks has drawn criticism from climate activists. They are concerned he will be unable to take the neutral stance required of a COP president. Critics, from Greta Thunberg to Al Gore, say Al Jaber is just a stalking horse for the fossil fuel industry's continuing efforts to stall the global climate agenda. Al Jaber, meanwhile, says he's uniquely positioned to reconcile the many interests in the climate fight. More than 100 members of the European Parliament and the US Congress declared in May that Al Jaber had severely jeopardized the COP process. Al Jaber is not wrong that the world requires cold-eyed realism, but no one knows where his version of realism will lead yet. For its part, the UAE has pledged to reduce its emissions by 19% by 2030, using 2019 as the baseline. Recently, though, under Al Jaber's leadership, the state-owned oil company announced plans to increase production by a total of more than 7 billion barrels, a move that clearly strains against this pledge. Parmeshwar Bava for NDTV.
So, many questions being raised, but of course, it is a hugely welcome step because climate change and its impact is very real. But moving now to our other big focus, Khalistani extremism on the soil of India's global allies and its diplomatic fallout. Now, after India's diplomatic tussle with Canada, over Nijjar's killing, the US has said that an Indian government employee was part of a conspiracy to kill Khalistani extremist Gurpatwant Singh Pannu. Well, Delhi's response has been rather guarded but firm. Now, going ahead, both sides, now close diplomatic partners, India and the US, are looking to take this ahead with sensitivity to each other's concerns and also a larger cooperation. But the big question, can India navigate this diplomatic tightrope? Here's a report.
A number of us have raised this directly with the Indian government in past weeks. The government announced today that it was conducting an investigation, and that's good and appropriate, and we look forward to seeing the results.
India remains a strategic partner, and we're going to continue to work to improve and strengthen that strategic partnership with India. At the same time, we take this very seriously.
United States responding to the bombshell from the nation's Justice Department, accusing an Indian official of being involved in a murder plot to eliminate a Sikh separatist on US soil. Earlier, distancing itself from allegations of a link to an attempted extrajudicial killing, India said it has already formed a high-level committee looking into US inputs on organized criminals, gun runners and terrorists.
This is a matter of concern. We have said, and let me reiterate, that this is also contrary to government policy.
The US Attorney's Office in New York and the Justice Department has alleged that an Indian national named Nikhil Gupta, now being held in the Czech Republic, was recruited to eliminate a Sikh extremist on US soil. An Indian official, described as a senior field officer, allegedly directed the reported plot. The hitman, allegedly hired to carry out the job, was in fact a US undercover police officer. And the intermediary through whom the hitman was hired turned out to be a US government source. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said that India needs to take the allegations he has raised seriously.
Which is that India needs to take this seriously. The Indian government needs to work with us to ensure that we're getting to the bottom of this.
New Delhi once again, however, called out Canada for shielding anti-India extremists.
Insofar as Canada is concerned, we have said that they have consistently given space to anti-India extremists and violence, and that is actually the heart of the issue.
Now in his mid-40s, US-based lawyer Pannu is best known as a founder and leader of Sikhs for Justice, one of the world's most active Khalistani organizations. New Delhi has identified SFJ's notorious founder as a terrorist years ago.
He has a track record which is there in the social media, and that track record is a pretty graphic one. So I would leave everybody to make their judgment.
From the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi nearly 4 decades ago to gang wars both in India and offshores and threats to diplomats, India has consistently alerted the US, Canada and the UK on the dangers posed by Khalistani extremists on their soil. Indian missions have been vandalized, diplomats targeted, and repeated requests of extradition of Sikh separatists have been turned down. The question is, what will it take for the West to wake up to the real and present danger that Khalistani terrorists pose for India? Bureau Report, NDTV. So, well, that is a big question. And joining us now on India Global, Ambassador Arun Singh, a former diplomat. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us on India Global this week. My first question to you, this comes close on the heels of the entire Canada episode. But are the allegations of Canada and the US comparable in any sense? Because what the US has done is that it has reached out to India for a cooperative probe. Meanwhile, Canada has still not put out any evidence in the public domain. What do you think? Are these two allegations comparable in any sense?
So there's clearly a difference in the way the US and Canada have handled it. And again, based on the information that is in the public domain and information that is there in the indictment, it would suggest that perhaps some information was shared by the US with Canada related to whatever the Canadians said. But if you look at the way the US handled it, private conversations between US officials, their Indian counterparts, and of course there is an indictment process, there is a judicial process that the US system has to go through. And then the information was also put out through leaks to the media. The first major leak related to how the US was handling it came out in Financial Times, not even a US paper. And later, of course, the US papers picked it up. So they handled it more discreetly and looking at effort to get collaboration, putting it through official channels. Whereas the Canadian Prime Minister, without, again, according to reports in the public domain, without really sharing anything with India, goes public with a major statement in front of the Canadian Parliament. And that's ratcheting up an issue without, going through measured search for cooperation or sharing information. So I think they handled it badly and unnecessarily politically raising the ante on the issue. And therefore, the Indian response to Canada and the Indian response to the US has been very, very different.
That's an important distinction you make there, Ambassador. But also looking at the larger issue, how does India really navigate the Khalistan issue diplomatically? While, of course, New Delhi has said that we have zero tolerance towards extremism in all its forms, but these are also close diplomatic allies of India that we're talking about, whether it's the UK, the US, even Australia. Canada, of course, we saw that diplomatic ties hit rock bottom because of the Niger issue. So is it going to be a diplomatic tightrope for India going ahead, navigating this Khalistan issue?
No, absolutely. And I think even those countries, US and Canada, say that extremism, terrorism, violence is not acceptable. And I think the relationship with Canada partly impacted by what you call the Khalistan issue, but more by the way the Canadians have handled it. And again, if you see the statements coming out from India, it's the perception here is that a section of the Canadian political leadership, which depends on votes of certain segment of the community there, they are far more tolerant of extremism and violence directed against India that is originating from there. So they are looking at it from their own perspective, their own political compulsions, going against the norms that they themselves espouse. So there is clearly a double standard there.
That's an important point you make there. And of course, taking a cue from that, why do you think countries like Australia and Canada, who have close ties with India, refuse to act against Khalistani separatists? Do you think they even acknowledge India's concerns?
Now, a relationship with many of these countries, US, Canada, UK, Australia, where some of this activism takes place. And you must remember that this kind of extremist activism against India, encouraging violence and terrorism, is done by a very small segment, just that they're very, very vocal in terms of what they do, is being done in countries with which India had a difficult relationship for a long time. Now, of course, the relationship is taking a different trajectory. So we have to come out of the legacy of the past. Secondly, in many of these countries, the official line is that they allow for freedom of expression. So they cannot take action against people just because they are espousing a certain kind of political perspectives, but that they do not accept encouragement of violence and terrorism. And so, but even there, I think perception in India is that even when there is encouragement of violence and terrorism, these countries, for their own political compulsions, based on wanting to get the votes from a certain section of the community, are not taking effective action. And that's something they need to address. Clearly, India's objective would be to further deepen cooperation with many of these countries, to work for making sure that the compulsions that political leaders in these countries face going ahead, based on political developments taking place, are far more conducive to their being, sensitive to India's concerns. So I think that has to be the strategy. And that is happening.
Absolutely. And, India has faced the brunt of terrorism enough. And India has said that terrorism in all its forms is condemnable. Well, that's it on this edition of India Global. See you next week. From all of us here. Goodbye.